At 65 years old, Martha Vance stood on the concrete sidewalk and watched a man in a blue uniform drill the lock out of her own front door. But what her children didn't know, what they were too blinded by their own greed to see, is that a mother's memory is longer than any legal document they could forge in a dark room. They thought they were taking her home, but they were actually handing her the key to their own public destruction. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from the people you raised with your own hands, if you've been told you were losing your mind when you were actually just finding your voice, or if you've ever seen your life's work stolen by those who should have protected you, then Martha's story is for you. Subscribe now and stay until the very last sentence, because the truth Martha found inside a ghost town will make you believe that justice never forgets a name. The morning was clear and cruelly bright. Martha clutched the handle of her single suitcase. It was a battered leather thing that had seen better decades. Beside her, her son Jason checked his gold watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at the locksmith. "We're doing this for your own safety, Mom," Jason said. He didn't look at her because his eyes were already scanning the neighborhood, perhaps estimating the property value of the surrounding lots. The court agreed. "You can't manage a house this size anymore. It's a liability." His sister, Sarah, stood near the idling SUV. She was busy scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving in a rapid, indifferent rhythm. She looked up only once to adjust her designer sunglasses. "It's for the best, Martha," Sarah added. She had stopped calling her Mom 3 months ago, right around the time the first medical evaluation was signed. "You'll be much more comfortable in the new place. It's practical. It's a clean break." The locksmith pulled the cylinder from the door. It made a sharp, metallic sound that echoed off the brick of the porch. Martha felt a phantom pain in her chest, right where she used to pin her husband's carnation every Sunday for 40 years. Her hand went to the pocket of her wool coat. Her fingers closed around a heavy circular object. It was a silver compass. The glass face was cracked in a jagged line that ran directly across the north, marking it had belonged to her father, a man who navigated the North Atlantic when the world was still large and terrifying. She didn't speak. She knew that any word she uttered would be recorded and used as further evidence of her disturbed mental state. Instead, she looked at the house. She had spent 40 years ensuring every corner of that building was a sanctuary. She had worked as the lead logistics coordinator for Vance Shipping, her late husband's firm, but she had never drawn a paycheck. She had balanced the books on the kitchen table while the children slept. She had navigated 3 different economic recessions from a desk in the den, ensuring the company stayed afloat while her husband handled the public-facing side of the business. When Jason needed a private tutor for his entrance exams, Martha sold the emerald earrings her grandmother had smuggled out of Ireland in a sewing kit. When Sarah wanted a wedding that lasted 3 days and cost more than a mid-sized sedan, Martha spent 6 months sewing the lace onto the gown by hand to save on the couture fees. She had been the silent engine of the family. She had been the one who remembered birthdays, anniversary dates, and the specific dosages of her husband's heart medication during his final years. She had spent the last 24 months of his life sleeping on a small cot in a hospital room, managing global shipping manifests on a laptop, while the hum of his oxygen machine provided the only soundtrack to her nights. She had given everything, and now her children stood on her lawn like creditors at an auction. Jason handed the locksmith a stack of $20 bills. He didn't look at the man's face. He looked at the new keys. "The car is waiting, Mom," Jason said. He didn't offer to take her suitcase. "The driver knows the way to the Oakhaven property. It's what you and Dad always talked about, right? Peace and quiet." He said the word property, the way a person describes a landfill. He knew Oakhaven was a ghost town. He knew the post office, there was a ruin. He believed he was discarding her in a place where she would quietly fade away, leaving the Vance shipping assets to be divided between him and his sister. Sarah finally put her phone away. She walked over and gave Martha a brief, stiff hug. It was the kind of hug one gives a distant relative at a funeral they didn't want to attend. "We'll call you next week to see how you're settling in," Sarah lied. The driver opened the back door of a black sedan that Martha didn't recognize. The leather inside smelled of new car and artificial pine. Martha took one last look at the front door of her home. The new lock was brass. It looked cheap against the dark oak of the door. She climbed into the back seat. She didn't look back as the car pulled away from the curb. She didn't look at her children as they stood on the lawn, already pointing at the roofline and discussing renovation costs. She reached into her pocket and gripped the silver compass. The cracked glass bit into the palm of her hand. She watched the neighborhood she had lived in for half a century disappear through the rear window. She was 65 years old. She had $14.62 in her purse. She was being sent to a town that had been removed from most maps 20 years ago. She didn't cry. The sedan moved silently through the outskirts of the city. Martha Vance sat in the back seat, 65 years old and perfectly still. She watched the industrial parks give way to rusted fences and overgrown fields. Her mind went back to the small desk in the den of the house she had just lost. For 35 years, that desk had been the true headquarters of Vance Shipping. She had sat there every morning at 5 o'clock while the house was still dark. She made a single pot of coffee and began the manifests. She coordinated the arrival of containers in 3 different time zones. She knew the names of the captains and the weight of the fuel loads. She had been 3 credits away from a degree in maritime law when Jason was born. She had closed her textbooks that night because her husband needed her to manage the office. She never opened them again. When the company hit a dry spell in the 90s, she stopped taking even a nominal salary. She told herself it was an investment in their future. She told herself the children would see the value of hard work. She remembered the winter. Jason turned 12. He had wanted a specialized racing bike that cost more than their mortgage payment. Martha had spent 6 months taking on extra freelance auditing work for a local firm. She worked until 2 in the morning every night. She presented him with the bike on Christmas morning. He hadn't thanked her. He had complained about the color of the frame. She had smiled anyway and told him it was the fastest model on the market. She had believed in the equity of effort. She thought that if she poured enough of herself into the foundation, the building would stand forever. She didn't realize she was building a house for people who only cared about the view from the balcony. Her hands were resting in her lap. They were the hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime at a keyboard and a stove. The knuckles were slightly swollen. The skin was thin and translucent like parchment. She touched the silver compass in her pocket. It was cool and heavy. It felt like an anchor in a world that had suddenly lost its gravity. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. He was a young man with a neutral expression. He had been hired to transport a confused elderly woman to a rural address. He didn't see the woman who had once navigated a legal dispute with a Singaporean port authority over a lost shipment of grain. Martha looked out the window. She saw a gas station with a faded sign and 2 rusted pumps. The pavement was cracked. This was the landscape of the forgotten. It was where the world sent things it no longer wanted to maintain. She remembered a specific afternoon 3 years ago. It was just after her husband's funeral. Jason had sat in the living room and asked for the password to the company's main server. He hadn't asked how she was sleeping. He hadn't asked if she needed help with the estate taxes. "We just need to ensure continuity, Mum," he had said. He had used that same soft, professional voice he used today. "It's what Dad would have wanted. We don't want you worrying about the technical side of things anymore." She had given him the password. She had trusted him because he was her son. She had watched him take the laptop from her desk. He had carried it out of the room like a trophy. That was the day the locks began to turn, one by one, until she was finally standing on the sidewalk. She opened her purse. She counted the money again. $10, 4 singles, 2 quarters, 1 dime, 2 pennies, $14.62. It was not enough for a hotel. It was not enough for a bus ticket back to the city. The car began to slow. The road had turned from asphalt to gravel. The dust rose in a grey cloud behind the tires. The trees were dense here, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. She thought about the coffee she used to make at 5 in the morning. She thought about the smell of the old oak desk. Those things were gone now. They belonged to the new owners. They belonged to the people who believed that loyalty was a weakness to be exploited. The sedan stopped in front of a brick building. It stood alone at the end of a deserted street. The windows were boarded with grey wood. The roof was sagging under the weight of thick green ivy. "We're here," the driver said. He didn't get out to help her. He simply hit the button to pop the trunk. Martha opened the door. The air smelled of damp earth and old brick. She stood on the gravel and watched the sedan turn around. It moved quickly, as if the driver were afraid the decay of the town might be contagious. The red taillights disappeared into the trees. She was alone. The office of Henderson and Associates was located on the 42nd floor of a building made of steel and ego. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass. The city of Seattle looked like a toy set below them, grey and distant. Martha Vance sat in a chair that felt like cold, expensive leather. She was 65 years old, and for the first time in her life, she felt like a guest in her own history. Jason sat across from her. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Martha's first car. He was polishing his cufflinks with a silk cloth. Sarah sat next to him. She was tapping a manicured fingernail against her tablet. They didn't look at Martha. They looked at the mahogany table. "It's a difficult conversation, Mom," Jason began. He stopped polishing and leaned forward. He put his hands together in a perfect steeple. "But the medical evaluation is clear. Your memory lapses are becoming a safety issue for the firm." Martha looked at the report in the center of the table. It was 30 pages of heavy bond paper. It was filled with words like disorientation and cognitive decline. It claimed she had forgotten to lock the gates 3 times. It was a collection of carefully constructed lies. She had never forgotten a lock. She was the one who checked the seals on the containers in the rain. Sarah didn't look up. "We're just being realistic, Martha," she said. She had stopped calling her mum when the proceedings began. "The firm needs stable leadership. You can't manage the house while your health is in this state." "I am the majority shareholder," Martha said. Jason sighed. Miller wouldn't meet Martha's eyes. "The court has already reviewed the testimony, Mum," Jason said. "The temporary conservatorship is already in effect. We want this to be a clean break." The attorney pushed a folder across the glass table. The paper made a dry, sliding sound, like a blade across a whetstone. "The house to the children," the attorney read. "The shipping company to the children. The investment accounts to the children." Martha received the transition settlement. "You're not getting nothing, Mom," Jason said. He looked at the ceiling. "You're getting the Oak Haven property. It's a clean break. You'll have your independence there. It's what you always said you wanted. Peace and quiet." "Oak Haven is a ghost town, Jason," Martha said. "The post office has been abandoned since the mills closed in the 90s. There is no power. There is no water." "You should have been more financially responsible, Mom," Jason said. He checked his watch. "This is what happens when you live without thinking ahead. We're being practical. We're giving you a roof over your head." Sarah swiped a finger across her tablet. "I'm ordering lunch," she said. "Does anyone want a salad? I think I'll get the kale with the lemon vinaigrette. I have a Pilates class at 2. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't ask if Martha had eaten breakfast. She was busy deciding on a side of avocado while her mother's life was being dismantled into 3 neat piles of paper. "You are using a ruin as a dumping ground for a mother you no longer want to see," Martha said. "We're worried about you, Mom," Jason said. He stood up. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the glass. He spoke as if he were discussing a supply chain adjustment. He didn't see the engine. He only saw the rust. Martha looked at the silver compass in her lap. She didn't scream. She stood up slowly. Her knees made a faint clicking sound in the quiet office. "I hope the kale is fresh, Sarah," Martha said. She turned and walked toward the door. The carpet was thick and swallowed the sound of her footsteps. She didn't look back at the glass table or the 30 pages of medical fraud. She didn't look at the children she had sacrificed her own education to raise. The elevator ride down took 40 seconds. She watched the floor numbers count down. 42, 40. Each number was a year of her marriage. Each number was a sacrifice. She stepped out into the lobby. The air smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax. She walked through the revolving doors and into the noise of the street. The city was loud and indifferent. She reached into her pocket and felt the crack in the compass glass. It was sharp. She began to walk. Martha stood on the corner of 4th and Madison. The glass tower of Henderson and Associates loomed behind her. The midday sun reflected off the windows, but the heat did not reach the sidewalk. Martha felt a deep, localized cold in her hands. She opened her black leather purse. She pulled out a small vinyl wallet. She began to count the bills and coins. There was 1 $10 bill. There were 4 single-dollar bills. There were 2 quarters, 1 dime, and 2 pennies. $14.62. This was the sum total of 40 years of logistics management. This was the remaining balance of a life spent ensuring every ship reached its harbor. She put the money back into the wallet. She tucked the wallet into the inner pocket of her suitcase. She reached for her phone. The screen was a black mirror. She pressed the side button. The lock screen showed the time and the date. Below the time, there was a single notification. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from Jason or Sarah. There were no emails from the company she had helped build from a single desk and a landline. She had expected a moment of regret from them. She had expected a last-minute text saying they had gone too far. The screen remained blank. The silence of the device was a physical weight. It was the sound of a door locking from the outside. A city bus hissed to a stop. The doors folded open. People pushed past her to get on. Martha didn't move. She looked at the silver compass in her hand. The crack in the glass distorted the needle. She turned the compass. The needle shook. It pointed toward the north, toward the rugged hills where the old Oakhaven town site sat in the shadows of the pines. She remembered what Jason had said. He had called the Oakhaven post office a property. He had said she would be more comfortable there. He had used the language of care to describe an exile. She knew what Oakhaven was. It was a place where the mail stopped being delivered in 1994. It was a place where the only economy was the slow growth of moss over stone. She looked at her suitcase. It was a heavy, rectangular weight. It contained 3 changes of clothes and a pair of sturdy shoes. It held her marriage certificate and a photograph of her husband in his merchant marine uniform. She walked away from the bus stop. She didn't have enough money for a taxi. She didn't have enough money for a hotel. She began to walk toward the terminal where the regional shuttles departed. The terminal smelled of diesel fumes and floor cleaner. Martha stood in line at the ticket window. A woman with tired eyes looked at her through the plexiglass. "One way to Oakhaven," Martha said. "The shuttle only goes as far as the crossroads," the woman said. "It's a 4-mile walk from there to the town site." "You sure about that?" "I'm sure," Martha said. The ticket cost $12.50. Martha handed over the $10 bill and 3 singles. The woman pushed back 50 cents and a paper slip. Martha had $2.12 left in the world. She sat on a wooden bench in the waiting area. She watched the clock on the wall. The second hand moved in a jerky, mechanical rhythm. She didn't look at her phone again. She didn't check for messages. She knew that the people she had raised were already moving her furniture into the basement. She looked at the silver compass. She rubbed her thumb over the cracked glass. The needle was steady now. It pointed toward the trees. It pointed toward the ruin her children had given her as a final insult. She felt a strange, quiet clarity. She had navigated ships through typhoons in the South China Sea from a desk. She had managed the arrival of 10,000 tons of steel in a frozen harbor. She could navigate 4 miles of gravel road. The shuttle driver called out the destination. Martha stood up. Her knees ached with a dull throb. She picked up her suitcase. The handle was cold. She boarded the small white van. There were only 2 other passengers. They were men in work clothes who didn't look up when she sat down. The van pulled out. She watched the city skyline shrink in the side mirror. The glass towers became small. The noise of the traffic faded. The van moved onto the highway, heading north. She thought about the desk in the den. She thought about the empty space where her computer used to sit. Those things were just wood and silicon. She still had the compass. She still had her name. The van left the highway an hour later. The road became narrow. The trees grew closer to the pavement. The light changed from the harsh gray of the city to the deep green of the forest. The driver pulled over at a gravel turnout. There was no sign. There was only a dirt path that disappeared into the brush. "This is the crossroads," the driver said. "Oakhaven is that way. Stay on the path." Martha stepped out of the van. The gravel crunched under her boots. The air was thin and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The van pulled away. The sound of the engine vanished quickly. The silence of the woods was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of wind in the high branches. Martha adjusted the strap of her bag. She looked at the compass one more time. The needle pointed straight down the path. She began to walk. The gravel road ended at a circle of dead weeds and rusted machinery. Martha Vance reached the edge of what had once been the town of Oakhaven. Her suitcase felt like it was filled with lead weights. Her right knee was a hot, pulsing knot of pain that radiated down to her ankle. She stopped and leaned against a leaning fence post. She pulled the silver compass from her pocket. The needle was steady. It pointed directly toward a cluster of gray buildings a few hundred yards ahead. The sun was low now. The shadows of the Douglas firs stretched across the road like long, dark fingers. Oakhaven was a skeleton of a town. There was a general store with a faded red awning that flapped in the wind. There was a diner with checkered curtains that had turned yellow with age. Two rusted gas pumps stood in front of a garage, their glass dials smashed. Martha walked past the general store. A man sat on a wooden crate in the shade of the awning. He was thin, with skin the color of old leather and a beard that reached his chest. He wore a faded denim jacket and a cap with a maritime logo. He was whittling a piece of cedar with a pocket knife. He didn't look up as she approached. He spoke before she reached the steps. "The bus dropped you at the crossroads 20 minutes late," the man said. Martha stopped. She tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. "How did you know I was coming?" The man stopped whittling. He looked up. His eyes were a sharp, clear blue. "Elias Thorne. I was the court clerk here for 30 years. Before the world decided Oakhaven didn't need a zip code anymore." He stood up slowly. His joints made a dry, popping sound. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked at the silver compass in Martha's hand. "Arthur told us you'd come eventually after he passed," Elias said. "He said to watch for a woman with a silver compass and a navigator's eyes. That's you, isn't it?" "My father hasn't been in Oakhaven for 50 years, Martha said. "A man like Arthur never really leaves a place," Elias replied. He pointed a calloused finger toward the end of the street. "The post office is the red brick building. The keys are under the loose stone near the mounting block. Your father paid the taxes on it every year until he died. Your children think they gave you a ruin. They don't know the history of this soil." Martha didn't ask how he knew about her children. In a town this small, the wind seemed to carry the scent of a secret before it was even whispered. "Thank you, Elias," Martha said. "I live in the trailer behind the store," Elias said. "If the roof leaks too fast, come find me. I have buckets and a tarp, but I think you'll find it sturdier than it looks." Martha walked toward the red brick building. It was a small, square structure built in the 1920s. It stood apart from the other shops. Thick vines of English ivy had climbed the walls, obscuring the windows and wrapping around the chimney. The roof sagged in the center. Above the door was a small semicircular transom window. The glass was stained a deep, vibrant cobalt blue. It was perfectly intact. Not a single crack marred its surface. The blue light caught the last of the sun. It cast a rectangular glow onto the dusty porch. It was the exact color of the ocean on a clear day in the North Atlantic. Martha knelt by the mounting block. Her knee screamed in protest. She moved a flat stone. She found a heavy iron key. It was coated in a thin layer of rust. She stood and fit the key into the lock. The mechanism was stiff. She had to use both hands to turn it. The metal groaned. The metal groaned, a long, protesting sound that echoed through the empty street. The door clicked open. A wave of stale air hit her. It smelled of old paper, cold stone, and the particular sweetness of decaying wood. Martha stepped inside. The floorboards were thick oak, covered in a thick layer of grey dust. Along the back wall stood the mail sorting bins. They were hundreds of small wooden cubbyholes, each one labeled with a faded brass number. The blue light from the transom window stretched across the floor. It pointed like a finger toward the sorting bins. Martha set her suitcase down. She didn't turn on a light. She knew the power had been cut decades ago. She walked to the center of the room and looked up at the ceiling. The rafters were thick and dark. She reached into her pocket and touched the compass. She was 65 years old. She was in a building with no heat. She was in a building with no water and a roof that was losing a battle with time. She walked to the sorting bins and ran her hand over the wood. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered. The silence of the room was heavy. It felt like a held breath. Martha sat on her suitcase. She didn't cry. She began to plan how to clear the dust. She was still here. The first night in Oakhaven was a lesson in the weight of silence. Martha Vance lay on her coat on the hard oak floor. The air was so cold it felt like a thin sheet of glass against her skin. Every time she shifted her weight, her lower back sent a sharp, electric jolt of pain down her left leg. It was a familiar ache from years of standing at sorting tables, but here, without a mattress, it felt like a betrayal by her own bones. The morning light came through the cobalt transom window in a long, bruised streak of blue. Martha sat up slowly. Her knees made a sound like dry gravel shifting in a pan. She looked at her hands. They were grey with dust and beginning to swell at the knuckles. She began her first day with a bucket she found in the corner. She walked to the communal well behind the general store. The iron handle was heavy. Each rotation of the crank pulled at the muscles in her shoulders. She carried the water back to the post office, one slow step at a time. She spent 8 hours scrubbing the floor. She used a piece of burlap she found in the basement and the remains of a bar of soap from her suitcase. She didn't have a broom. She used a bundle of stiff hemlock branches tied together with a strip of cloth. She swept the dust of 30 years into the street. Elias Thorne appeared in the doorway late that afternoon. He didn't ask if she was tired. He didn't offer a hollow sympathy. He was carrying a small, rusted kerosene heater and a gallon jug of fuel. "The wick is a bit charred," Elias said, "but it'll take the edge off the damp." He set it down on the clean patch of floor. He also placed a small loaf of bread and a jar of pickled beets on the mail sorting table. "I remember when your father brought you here," Elias said. "You were 6. You wore a yellow dress. You spent 3 hours trying to organize the dead letter bin by the color of the stamps." "I don't remember that," Martha said. "A navigator remembers the stars," Elias said. "A clerk remembers the details. I'll be back tomorrow to check the chimney flue." He left before she could thank him. Martha ate the bread in the fading light. It was the first thing she had eaten in 24 hours. By the 3rd day, the rain began. It was a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof that turned the world grey. Martha was trying to patch a hole in the rear wall using scrap wood and a heavy rock as a hammer. She slipped on a patch of wet floor. She went down hard on her right hip. The pain was sudden. It took her breath away. She lay on the cold wood, listening to the rain. She could hear water splashing into the buckets she had placed under the leaks. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The battery icon was a thin red line. It read 3%. There were no missed calls. There were no messages from Jason. There were no emails from Sarah. The last communication was a notification from her bank. It informed her that her access to the joint corporate account had been permanently revoked. She looked at the ceiling. A leak she hadn't noticed was beginning to form a dark circle directly above her. A single drop fell and landed on her forehead. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 65 years old with $2.12, and I cannot fix a leaky roof." The math of her survival was too large to look at directly. "This is where I die," she thought. "Not today, but this is where it ends. I am a discarded woman in a discarded town. My children were right. I am a liability that has been managed." The cold seemed to seep into her marrow. Her hip throbbed with every heartbeat. She considered staying on the floor. She considered letting the damp take her. It would be easier than standing up again. It would be a clean break. A small movement near the transom window caught her eye. A robin had flown in through a gap in the eaves. It was small and brown, its chest a dull orange. It landed on the edge of the cobalt glass. The bird shook the rain from its wings. It looked down at Martha with one black, unblinking eye. Then it let out a single, sharp chirp. The sound was tiny, but it cut through the rain like a whistle. The bird didn't look for permission to be there. It didn't ask if the building was a ruin. It simply adjusted its grip on the glass and began to preen its feathers. Martha watched the bird for a long time. She felt the silver compass in her pocket, a heavy weight against her thigh. She rolled onto her side. She ignored the scream of pain from her hip. She gripped the edge of the mail sorting bin and pulled herself up. Her legs shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "I'm not dying in a shed," Martha said. Her voice was cracked and thin, but it was hers. She didn't speak to the bird. She didn't speak to her father. She spoke to the empty, cold room. "I'm not dying because some man decided I wasn't worth keeping," she said louder. "I'm 65 years old and I still know how to read a manifest." She grabbed the bucket that had overflowed. She limped to the door and threw the water out into the mud. She didn't look at her phone again. She let the battery die in her pocket. She went back to the wall. She picked up the scrap wood. She picked up the rock. She began to hammer. The damp smell was coming from behind the central mail sorting unit. Martha Vance pushed against the heavy oak frame. Her shoulder muscles burned. The wood didn't move. She braced her feet against the floor and shoved again with the full weight of her 65 years. The unit slid 2 inches. It made a screaming sound on the grit. Behind the unit, the floorboards were different. They were made of cedar, not oak. They were not nailed down. Martha knelt. She used her fingernails to catch the edge of a board. It lifted easily. There was a cavity in the subfloor. It was lined with lead sheeting to keep out the moisture. Inside the cavity sat a heavy steel box. It was painted maritime grey. A small brass padlock held the hasp shut. Martha reached for the iron key she had found under the stone near the mounting block. She looked at the two teeth on the key. She had used the larger one for the front door. She tried the smaller tooth in the padlock. The lock clicked. The sound was loud in the empty room. Martha's hands began to tremble. She gripped the edge of the sorting table to steady herself. Her breath came in short, shallow hitches. She waited for her heart to slow. She felt the cold air of the post office pressing against her neck. She opened the box. On top was a thick envelope made of waxed paper. It was tied with a piece of twine. Below it was a small, plastic microcassette recorder. 2 spare batteries were taped to the side of it in a yellowing plastic wrap. Martha took the envelope out first. She untied the twine. Her fingers felt thick and clumsy. She pulled out a stack of documents. The paper was heavy and smelled of salt and old ink. The first page was a maritime trust deed dated 40 years ago. Martha read the first paragraph. She stopped. She blinked and read it again. The document stated that the initial capital for Vance shipping had been funded entirely by a maritime trust in her father's name. It was an inheritance intended for Martha alone. Her husband had been listed as a trustee, not the owner. The company assets were legally bound to a lineage trust. They could not be sold or transferred without the written consent of the primary beneficiary. Martha Vance was the primary beneficiary. She read the signatures at the bottom. Her husband's hand was steady. Her father's signature was the bold, looping script. There was a second document. It was a formal amendment to the trust. It stated that in the event of her husband's death, the control of the trust did not pass to his heirs. It remained with Martha. The medical conservatorship her children had filed was based on the idea that the assets belonged to the estate, but the trust existed outside the estate. It was a separate legal entity. Jason and Sarah had stolen a company that didn't belong to their father. They had stolen a company that belonged to her. Martha felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She sat on the floor, the papers scattered around her. The blue light from the transom window was fading into grey. She picked up the microcassette recorder. The batteries were still in their wrap. She unwrapped them with her teeth. She slid them into the compartment. She pressed the play button. The tape hissed for several seconds. Then, her husband's voice filled the room. It was younger. It was the voice of a man who still had air in his lungs. "Martha," the voice said, "if you're hearing this, it means you've finally gone back to Oakhaven. I hope things didn't come to this. But I saw the way Jason looked at the ledgers last Christmas. I saw the way Sarah was already talking about the house in the hills." The tape clicked. He must have paused. "They came to me, Martha," the voice continued. "Both of them. They wanted me to sign a power of attorney while I was in the hospital. They even brought a doctor friend of Jason's, a man named Sterling. They thought I was too tired to notice the fraud. I didn't sign, but I knew then that they wouldn't stop with me. I put the original deeds in the post office safe. The court records in the city are vulnerable. These are not. They are the only copies that matter. Take them to Thorne. He knows what to do." The tape ended with a soft, mechanical click. Martha sat in the silence. The rain started again, a soft tapping on the bricks. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver compass. She looked at the cracked glass. She looked at the needle. It was still pointing north. It was pointing toward the truth that had been hidden under her feet while she was being escorted out of her own home. She wasn't a liability. She wasn't a confused woman in a ruin. She was the owner of everything her children were currently trying to sell. She stood up. Her hip still ached, but the pain felt distant. She gathered the papers and put them back into the box. She tucked the recorder into her coat pocket. She walked to the window. The town of Oakhaven was dark. Only a single light flickered in Elias Thorne's trailer behind the store. Martha looked at her hands. They were dirty. They were work-worn. They were steady. The needle had found the shore. The morning after the discovery, the air inside the Oakhaven post office felt different. It was still cold, but the dampness no longer felt like a shroud. Martha Vance stood at the center of the room with a rusted crowbar she had borrowed from Elias Thorne. She was 65 years old, and her hands were steady as she began to pull the rot from the corners of her life. She started with the boarded-up windows. One by one, she pried the gray, weathered planks from the frames. The nails groaned as they surrendered to the iron. When the last board fell, the room flooded with a sudden, sharp light that revealed 40 years of dust suspended in the air. Martha spent 3 days cleaning the glass. She didn't have commercial cleaner. She used a mixture of white vinegar Elias had traded for a few hours of her time organizing his inventory. and a bucket of warm water from the well. She scrubbed until her shoulders burned and her fingers went numb from the cold water. When she reached the cobalt transom window above the door, she worked with a soft cloth. She wiped away layers of soot and spiderwebs until the glass glowed like a sapphire. In the late afternoon, the sun hit the blue pane and cast a long, rectangular pool of light across the oak floor. It looked like a path of deep water leading to the sorting bins. The bins themselves became her first project of organization. She used a small piece of fine grit sandpaper to smooth the rough edges of the wood. She polished the brass numbers with a paste made of salt and lemon juice. The numbers 3, 7, and 9 began to catch the light. She used the bins to categorize the documents from the hidden safe. Section 1 was for the maritime trust deeds. Section 2 was for the medical fraud evidence. Section 3 was for the letters from her father. She was a logistics coordinator once again, but this time, the cargo was her own survival. She moved her suitcase and her coat to the small room in the back that had once been the postmaster's office. She found a heavy wool rug rolled up in the corner. She dragged it outside and beat it with a broom handle until the dust stopped rising. She laid it over the clean floor. It was a deep forest green, faded but thick. Elias arrived on the 5th day with a stack of cedar shingles and a bucket of tar. He didn't ask for payment. Martha had already spent the morning relabeling the shelves in his general store and creating a manual ledger for his hardware supplies. It was a fair trade. "The ridge beam is solid," Elias said from the top of a ladder, "but the flashing around the chimney is gone. It's a 2-hour job." Martha stood on the ground and handed him the tools. She watched as he worked, his movements slow and practiced. She looked at the building. The ivy had been trimmed back from the windows. The bricks had been scrubbed of the green mold. The post office was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress. Inside, Martha focused on the details. She found a small pot-bellied stove in the basement that had been disconnected years ago. She cleaned the iron with a wire brush until the black surface shone. She found a stash of seasoned oak in the woodpile behind the building. When she lit the first fire, the smell of wood smoke filled the room. It was a warm, sweet scent that drove out the smell of damp paper. She sat on her suitcase near the stove and watched the orange light flicker against the brick walls. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver compass. The cracked glass was clean now. She held it near the stove. The firelight reflected in the crack, making it look like a lightning bolt frozen in the crystal. The beauty of the room was not in its perfection. It was in the clarity of its purpose. It was in the clarity of its purpose. The floor was bare but clean. The windows were clear. The sorting bins were full of the weapons she would use to reclaim her name. The building was a mirror of her own state. The rot had been removed. The structural damage had been assessed. The foundation was stone, and it was deep. She looked at the cobalt light on the floor. It was beautiful. By the first Tuesday of November, the post office was no longer a shell. It was a heart. Martha Vance sat at the central sorting table. She was 65 years old, and she was no longer waiting for a phone to ring. She looked at the empty black screen of her smartphone. It sat on the corner of the desk like a dead insect. She didn't charge it. She didn't check for messages. She realized she had spent 40 years defining herself by the needs of the people on the other end of that device. That woman was gone. She had been replaced by someone who knew the exact weight of a cedar shingle and the thermal capacity of a pot-bellied stove. She felt a strange, quiet throb in her hands. It wasn't the ache of labor. It was the steady, rhythmic pulse of a body that finally knew where it belonged. It was a physical sensation of peace that started in her fingertips and settled deep in her lungs. She looked up at the rafters. "You were right about the foundations, Arthur," she whispered to the empty room. "The stone goes deeper than the frost line. You knew I'd need something that wouldn't shake." The community of Oakhaven began to arrive without an invitation. It started with Mrs. Gable, the woman who owned the diner with the yellowed curtains. She didn't bring a casserole. She brought a stack of property tax assessments that the county had been raising every year without explanation. "Elias said you knew how to read the fine print," Mrs. Gable said. She sat across from Martha at the sorting table. Martha spent 4 hours tracing the assessment codes. She found a clerical error that had been compounding since 1998. She showed Mrs. Gable the exact line where the overcharge began. Then came the men from the logging camp, 3 miles up the ridge. They were being squeezed by a middleman at the railhead who claimed the shipping rates had doubled. Martha sat with them for an afternoon. She used the old maritime ledgers to prove the railhead was using an expired tariff schedule. She was the coordinator again. But she wasn't shipping steel or grain for a corporate board. She was navigating the lives of people the world had decided were too small to matter. They didn't offer her charity. They offered her fresh eggs, a cord of seasoned maple, and a new pane of glass for the back office. It was a recognition between equals. A local boy named Toby arrived one afternoon with a bucket of blue paint. He spent 3 days painting the trim around the windows. He didn't say much. He just worked. "My grandfather said this place used to be the only way the world talked to us," Toby said as he cleaned his brush. "He said if the post office is open, the town isn't dead yet." Martha stood on the porch and looked down the street. The general store had a new coat of wax on the floors. The diner had a fresh sign. The silence of Oakhaven had changed. It was no longer the silence of an ending. It was the quiet of a machine being oiled and readied for a long journey. She reached into her pocket and touched the silver compass. She didn't need to check the needle. She knew exactly where she was standing. She walked back inside and opened the Maritime Trust folder. She began to draft the formal appeal to the Superior Court. She used the heavy, official stationery she had found in the back of a drawer. She wrote with a fountain pen. The ink was a deep, permanent black. She didn't use the language of a victim. She used the language of a navigator. She felt the heat from the stove on her back. The air smelled of wood smoke and old paper. She was ready. A black SUV pulled into the gravel circle in front of the Oakhaven post office. The tires made a sharp, grinding sound against the stones. Martha Vance sat behind her sorting table. She was 65 years old, and she didn't look up from her ledger when the engine cut out. Jason and Sarah stepped out of the vehicle. They looked like two bright, synthetic shapes against the muted grays and browns of the town. Jason wore a tailored overcoat. Sarah had a silk scarf wrapped tight against the mountain air. They picked their way across the mud with the exaggerated care of people who didn't want to touch the ground. They stepped onto the porch. The oak boards didn't creak. Martha had reinforced them 2 weeks ago with 3-inch steel screws. Jason pushed open the door. He paused in the entryway, his eyes scanning the room. "Mom," Jason said. His voice was thick with a forced, vibrating warmth. "We've been so worried about you. We haven't been able to reach you on your phone for weeks." He walked toward the center of the room. He didn't look at the cobalt transom window. He looked at the mud on the toes of his Italian leather loafers. He made a small, tight face of disgust before smoothing his expression back into a mask of concern. The neighbors in the city were asking, "Martha," Sarah said. She stayed near the door. She didn't want the smell of wood smoke to settle in her hair. "We're just being realistic. This place isn't safe for a woman alone. There's no cell service. The nearest hospital is 40 miles away. I am perfectly safe," Martha said. She finally looked up. Her eyes were clear. She didn't offer them a seat. Jason leaned his hands on the sorting table. He saw the corner of the blue maritime folder peeking out from under the ledger. His eyes went still for a fraction of a second. "We saw the filing from the appeals court, Mom," Jason said. He lowered his voice. He used the tone a doctor uses to deliver bad news. "There's obviously been a huge misunderstanding. The paperwork you found, it's old. It's out of date. We're worried that you're being taken advantage of by some local people. It's for the best if you just come back with us now," Sarah added. She took a step forward. "We've already looked at a lovely assisted living suite near the park. It's a clean break. You won't have to worry about a thing." Martha stood up. She was several inches shorter than her son, but she didn't lean away from him. She smoothed the front of her wool cardigan. Her hands were stained with cedar oil. "You didn't come because you were worried about my safety, Jason," Martha said. Her voice was as steady as a dial tone. "You came because the Maritime Trust freeze hit your operating accounts yesterday morning." Jason's face went pale. The mask of concern slipped. His jaw tightened until a small muscle in his cheek began to pulse. "You used a fraudulent medical report to take my home," Martha continued. "You paid a man named Sterling to say my memory was failing. You did it so you could divide assets that were never part of your father's estate. You knew about the trust. You just thought I'd never find the original deeds. Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Jason said. He reached for the folder on the table. Martha placed her hand firmly on top of the blue paper. She didn't snatch it away. She simply held her ground. "I am 65 years old," Martha said. "I spent 40 years ensuring you were fed, educated, and protected. I did the work while you took the credit. I am not a liability. I am the owner of the firm. You can't prove anything with some old papers and a ghost town story, Sarah snapped. Her voice had lost its silk. It was thin and sharp. I have the tape, Sarah, Martha said. I have your father's voice describing the day you brought a bribe to his hospital bed. I have the micro cassette. It is already in the hands of the appellate judge. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the pot-bellied stove. Jason looked at his sister. Sarah looked at the floor. The concern was gone. The realism had evaporated. They were just two people in expensive coats, standing in a room that no longer belonged to them. We can fix this, Mum, Jason whispered. We're family. You are my children, Martha said, and I am a navigator. I am steering this ship back to the shore. You can leave now. She turned her back to them. She picked up a stack of letters from the men at the logging camp. She didn't watch them walk out. She didn't listen to the SUV engine start. She didn't look out the window as the gravel sprayed against the side of the building. The door clicked shut. 1 year after the morning she arrived at the crossroads, Martha Vance sat in the front row of the Superior Court. The room smelled of floor wax and heavy law books. Judge Halloway did not look at the lawyers when he began to read his decision. He spoke for 12 minutes about the sanctity of maritime law and the specific evidence of medical coercion. He used words like fraudulent and malicious intent. The judge vacated the conservatorship in its entirety. He ordered the immediate restoration of all assets to the Vance Maritime Trust. He directed the state attorney to investigate the medical testimony of Dr. Sterling. Martha didn't cheer. She didn't look at the empty chairs behind her where Jason and Sarah should have been sitting. They had sent an associate to hear the ruling. They were already busy selling their luxury SUVs. Martha reached into the pocket of her navy wool coat. She felt the silver compass. She ran her thumb over the cracked glass one last time. She didn't need to look at it to know where she was heading. The court adjourned with a single, sharp strike of the gavel. Martha walked out of the building and into the spring rain. By the following evening, she was back in Oakhaven. The post office was no longer a ruin. The bricks were clean, and the cobalt transom window caught the last of the light. The ivy had been trimmed into a neat frame around the door. Inside, the pot-bellied stove was glowing. Martha sat at her sorting table and opened a fresh ledger. She wasn't managing global shipping containers anymore. She was managing the rebirth of a town. She looked at the photograph of her husband on the wall. He was young in the picture, wearing his merchant marine cap and smiling at the camera. "The cargo is home, Richard," she whispered. She set the silver compass on top of the ledger. The needle settled instantly, pointing toward the mountains. She left it there, no longer needed for the journey. She closed the ledger. The room was warm. 2 years after the morning she arrived at the crossroads, the town of Oakhaven no longer appeared as a grey smudge on the mountain maps. The post office had become a regional sorting hub for small-scale mountain deliveries and community records. Martha Vance sat on the porch in a new rocking chair made of solid cherry wood. She was 67 years old. Her hands were still calloused and marked by the work of 3 seasons, but they no longer shook when she held a pen. She watched a young girl in a yellow dress run across the street toward the general store. The sound of children's laughter moved through the air, replacing the hollow whistle of the wind. The town was breathing again. Martha stood up and walked inside the brick building. The air was warm and smelled of beeswax and fresh coffee. She went to the mantel above the pot-bellied stove. The silver compass sat there in a small, velvet-lined box. The afternoon sun hit the cobalt transom window above the door. The blue light moved across the room and illuminated the compass. The cracked glass reflected the light, casting a tiny, fractured rainbow against the red brick. Martha didn't need to look at the needle to know which way was north. She knew exactly where she was standing. She picked up a fountain pen and signed a shipping manifest for the local logging collective. The ink was dark and permanent. She looked up at the blue glass one last time before the sun dipped behind the ridge. "Thank you for the map, Dad," Martha whispered to the quiet room. She turned back to her desk and began the evening ledger. Martha's story proves that the world can take your home, your money, and your title, but it cannot take the internal North Star that guides you through the storm. True justice is not just a legal ruling. It is the act of building a life that the people who betrayed you can no longer touch. She was home. If Martha's story moved you, if you've ever felt the world tried to write your final chapter, before you were even finished with the prologue, this was written for you. Leave one word in the comments, describing the feeling of the cobalt light hitting the dusty floor. Because Martha's story proves something that is always true. A mother's legacy is built on the strength of her foundation, not the gratitude of those who stand upon it. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their greatest discovery might be hidden under the flaws of the place they were told to forget. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.